I think we're actually at capacity, so I'm going to go ahead and welcome everybody. Hi everyone. Some of you are in the webinar, some of you will be joining the live stream right now. I want to welcome you to the annual Lynch Distinguished Lecturer Series, The Unfinished Business of Cruel Optimism, Affect, Crisis, and Sentimentality. I'm Dana Seitler, and I'm the director of the Bottom Center for Sexual Diversity Studies. I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement. The sacred land on which we operate at the University of Toronto has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, and the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action reaffirms that the treaties with Indigenous peoples must be lawfully honored. We are all treaty peoples and are responsible for honoring and upholding those agreements. We are grateful for the opportunity to work on this territory and to share this space, if only virtually, with all of you. Today's event will run for about an hour and a half. I have asked each speaker to talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to a conversation. We would like you to be a large part of this conversation. And so I'm going to ask you to type your questions, if you're in the webinar, into the Q&A slot. And if you're in the live stream on YouTube, into the chat there. The chat on the webinar is disabled, but you'll be able to use the Q&A for your questions. And then we will receive them and answer them here, obviously. And in fact, some of you may have arrived with questions. And so I would ask you to go ahead and type those into the Q&A or the chat right now, if you'd like. And for all the questions that we don't get to today, we will be sending copies of them to our speakers. And so they will receive them. Live captioning, as you should see, is available. So I began organizing this event really after a series or through a series of conversations with Lauren and Rebecca and Dana. In a general sense, I really wanted to sort of pay homage to Lauren's work. But more specifically, I wanted us to think collectively about our distinct relationships to the idea of cruel optimism, which is to say the various attachments we have, bidden and unbidden, to objects, human, inanimate, and conceptual and political, that move us or that keep us stuck. And I wanted to improvise a conversation about the affective present around those attachments or questions about them. The sentimental paradigm of Western democracy as all about models of inclusive citizenship or based in the ideal of a commons filled with rational discourse has been shattered in the age of Trump, but also in the neoliberal corporate capitalist politics of Trudeau or Biden but of course, it was always a white inflected fantasy or attachment to something that never existed anyway. So I invited Lauren and Rebecca and Dana to think through these questions with us, which are questions about feeling and belonging and politics that each of their intellectual projects speaks to in distinct ways. What are attachments to the desire for transformative revolution? How do we feel about the end of the world? How do we collect ourselves in response to the crisis of the present? I'm therefore thrilled to introduce these three humans to you today. I have a deep and abiding love for each one of them, and so it is a particular honor and pleasure to have them here. Dana Luciano is Associate Professor in the Departments of English and Women and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. She's the author of Arranging Grief, Sacred Time in the Body in 19th Century America, and she is currently working on a book project called How the Earth Feels, Geological Fantasy in the 19th Century US. Rebecca Wanzo is professor and chair of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Washington University, St. Louis. She's the author of The Suffering Will Not Be Televised, African American Women and Sentimental Political Storytelling, and recently, hot off the presses, The Content of Our Caricature, African-American Comic Art and Political Belonging. Lauren Berlant is the George M. Pullman Distinguished Service Professor of English at the University of Chicago. She is the author of a number of books, so maybe I'll just say most recently, but even that, The Female Complaint, The Unfinished Business of Sentimentality in American Culture, Cruel Optimism, Sex or the Unbearable with Lee Edelman, The Hundreds with Kathleen Stewart, and Desire Love. And so please join me in welcoming all three of them today. And so Dana, if you'd like to begin.
I'm going first. Okay, so my dog has been barking on and off while Dana was speaking. I don't know if she's going to be quiet now, but if she's not, you'll hear her too. So thank you, Dana, for bringing us together. I'm really excited and honored to be in this company, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I want to start by acknowledging that the land from which I'm zooming is Lenni Lenape land. And I do that in hope that this might provoke us to think more about the imbrication of the ongoing dispossession of Indigenous people and ongoing environmental devastation. It's that devastation specifically that animates the work I'm going to be talking about today. So not specifically the presidential crisis, not the COVID crisis, but the multiple global environmental and socio-environmental crises that are imperfectly indexed under the sign of the Anthropocene, which I think at this point has become like geological for a crisis ordinary. I want to think today about some of the ways that the logics of geology have come to structure the framing of crisis on a planetary scale, with respect to both time, that's planetary and epochal time, and space. I'm especially interested in the way that geology informs three renditions of crisis in the contemporary moment, but also how it manages to suffuse those sites with optimism, right? Not always cruel, but I think sometimes. And how that geologic optimism intersects with what, following Celia Winter, we might see as extant and emergent genres of the human. So the three areas I want to look at today are deep time, which is aligned with an optimism of disorientation, epochal time, which aligns with an optimism of intensification, and geological materialism, which aligns with recalibration. So my current research takes up writing about geology from the early 19th century through the lens of the present crisis. I started out looking at the first half of the 19th century when geology was called the fashionable science, in the words of one popular magazine. This moment interests me because it was also a time of so much invention, so much remapping, innovative thinking under the then new science of geology and its revelation of what we now call deep time, what they called the planet's high antiquity. Because of the new geological timescale,